Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words. And I'll stress a few words. I think it's always dangerous to ask a politician to make a short opening address, because chances are next thing it's Tuesday week and you haven't eaten for 5 days. So I will try and keep this relatively brief. In terms of how we do government here, it's a challenge to address the sort of issue that you're here to hear about today. The way I would look at it is, we do government vertically. You have government departments, Office of First Minister, Deputy First Minister, you have a Department of Health, Department of Justice, Department of Education, Department of Social Development, Rural Development, Regional Development, and so on. And we have a dozen. And they're all sometimes described as silos because they are vertical. But if you're trying to look at something like how we look after our elderly, or our young people, or victims of crime, or victims of the conflict, that tends to come in horizontally, and it will impact on 2, 3, 4, 5, anything up to all 12 government departments. And it's a huge challenge with the way we structure government, not just here, but be the same in Dublin, London, elsewhere. It's a huge challenge to get that cross-cutting involvement and buy-in from all the government departments. The particular difficulty we have here is that although we have a coalition government, effectively a mandatory coalition where the 5 big parties all have a seat at the cabinet table, although that happens, we don't actually play it, to my mind, as a strength, because right after the election we run the thing called the hunt, which divides up the government departments to the parties of government based on their electoral strength. And only after that do the people who are going to form the government sit around the table and say, right, well, what are we going to do? What is our programme for government going to be? But you would have noticed in 2010, after the Westminster election, when the Conservatives didn't get a majority and had to do a deal with the Liberal Democrats, within a week, and before they formed a cabinet, they agreed a programme for government. And then in Dublin, Fine Gael and Irish Labour sat down and within 6 days had produced a fairly meaty 64-page programme for government before they divided up the ministries between the parties. So we do it the other way around. We divide up and then we try and agree. And unless we can change that, we're always going to find it very, very difficult to look at those horizontal issues, which are the ones that really matter. How do we look after our older people, our younger people, our victims, our vulnerable, our needy, those in areas of multiple deprivation? It is of particular interest to the committee because older people's issues are a central strand of our work in scrutinising and assisting the Office of the First Minister. Protecting and safeguarding older people, of course, is vital, and elder abuse we would consider, for the reasons I've explained, to be a pressing problem. I would also acknowledge and note that elder abuse is often hidden, not obvious even to the victim, and often underreported. So statistics are not necessarily going to give us the entire answer. Anyway, enough of me. I'm going to welcome Janet Carter-Anand from Queen's University, who is going to present her findings, and I'm sure that what is presented today will be of great value not just to the committee of the Office of the First Minister, but to the office itself. Janet, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. I think those comments about a program of government are particularly relevant because what I want to do is talk about elder abuse in terms of a much broader concept of just protection and safeguarding. Firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to come along. I think here in Northern Ireland we have such a wonderful opportunity to sort of align policy, research, education and theory, and I think there's huge opportunities, and I thank Sally and Eileen for the work they've done in terms of developing this. Before I start, I wanted to actually acknowledge that we have a number of European social work students and academic staff from Poland, Slovenia, Italy, Germany, Austria and England, and Northern Ireland, hopefully, yeah. Anywhere I missed out? No? Cool. Okay, and they're currently in Belfast at QUB undertaking a very innovative project that's looking at learning in regards to working with intercultural conflict, and Belfast and Northern Ireland provide a wonderful opportunity to explore that for students. But this experience has really reinforced to me the actual need to develop more of an international perspective in regards to social work education, and also the way we look at elder abuse. I think huge opportunities, huge potential in terms of looking at what other countries are doing in regards to issues. Okay, this presentation is basically looking at different understandings of elder abuse and the potential implications for policy and practice. Traditionally, elder abuse policies have been developed from a top-down approach, guided by policymakers and practitioners' perspectives. However, this research that I'm going to present, which was funded by the Centre for Ageing Research and Development in Ireland, CARDI, hopes to provide a balance to this. As we consulted directly with older people about their perceptions of elder abuse, what they thought, and what they thought was appropriate in terms of supporting older people in the community. The specific objectives of the research were to identify what older people consider the main threats to their personal safety and well-being, and issues that related to disclosure, and what services and support they thought was useful or would be useful in addressing the needs of older people who are experiencing abuse. We utilised a grounded theory approach which involved 58 people aged 65 years and over, who took part in focus groups across Ireland. That's Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Okay, the rationale behind the study was threefold. Firstly, we know very little about older people's views on elder abuse. What we do know is that elder abuse is a socially constructed and defined social problem, and that there are many different ways that elder abuse can be defined and responded to. And historically, practitioners have used a variety of terms such as granny bashing, mistreatment, maltreatment, vulnerability. I guess I use the term elder abuse, which is basically an American term, but and it's not a term I use quite a lot, but I'm not really comfortable with it. It's still quite a contentious term or a contentious issue, as there are those who would still argue that labelling acts of violence, exclusion, denial of rights, financial fraud as elder abuse merely on the criteria based on age is fundamentally ageist and discriminatory and still can be counterproductive. But contrary to popular belief, there is a lack of a universally accepted definition of elder abuse. This may be viewed as problematic in relation to the prevention, identification and management of elder abuse at a policy and practice level or service level. Yet for many practitioners, elder abuse needs to be reviewed or viewed within specific cultural contexts, which then dictate mechanisms for prevention and appropriate responses. For example, across Ireland, we work from two definitions of elder abuse. In Northern Ireland, definition of abuse is outlined in the Safeguarding Vulnerable Adults policy and procedural guidelines. And it talks about the physical, psychological, emotional, financial and sexual maltreatment or neglect of vulnerable adults by another person, and that abuse may be a single act or a repeated act over a period of time, and that it can take multiple forms. Okay, in the Republic of Ireland, the definition of elder abuse in government policies and documents such as Protecting Our Future also talks about a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust which causes harm or distress to an older person or violates their human and civil rights. And there are slight differences between these definitions. I think the Northern Ireland definition is certainly much broader than the Republic's definition, but I think that the Republic talks about human and civil rights, which I think is a really interesting sort of slant. Yet despite these different definitions, the prevalent rates of elder abuse are pretty similar across the two regions and run between 2.2 to 2.6% of the over 65 population, although this is larger or can be a much more significant number when you include neighbours and acquaintances as perpetrators of abuse. So defining and labelling elder abuse and defining the prevalence or identifying the prevalence has tended to ignore how older people themselves conceptualise abuse. Okay, so the literature suggests that there is limited consensus between older people, carers and health professionals regarding what constitutes abuse. That health professionals are more likely to identify abuse than carers or healthy older people, and that abuse remains unacknowledged if people feel that there are no better management options and ways of reporting that leads to punitive action for the carer, and perhaps coupled with institutionalisation for the older person. So, and a local study even suggests that despite the level of guidance in the UK and the coordination and standardisation of services to protect older adults from abuse, there still remains a considerable amount of ambiguity as to the basic concepts of abuse and vulnerability. So overall, there's this growing dissatisfaction with current service-led concepts of vulnerability and abuse. For example, in the consultations on No Secrets in the UK in 2009, service users and their representatives provided 4 significant messages that I think we need to think about when we're looking at elder abuse. Firstly, that safeguarding is as much about empowerment as it is about vulnerability. I think we need to keep that balance. And that by making an issue of empowerment, it becomes everybody's business. That the concentration on abuse and vulnerability is very narrow, and that we need to be looking at elder abuse as a public health issue as well as a protection issue. That safeguarding adults is not equivalent to child protection, and this is one of the issues or the traps that I think we often fall into in terms of wanting to treat older people as children, and that even older people who lack capacity and have a right, do have a right to participate and be represented in regards to issues that affect their own lives. Okay. So before I go on to talk about the findings, I wanted to suggest more of a theoretical framework that really helps us understand the different ways that elder abuse is defined and responded to in an international context. I think we tend to become preoccupied with defining abuse and recording the prevalence, and that we tend to forget that the theoretical underpinnings and the assumptions involved in elder abuse. So what I have put up here is a chart that actually identifies a number of different ways elder abuse is perceived. And I guess there are 3 overlapping constructions of elder abuse and neglect that are pretty visible in service delivery and legislation internationally. The first looks at elder abuse and neglect of older people as a form of vulnerability, and that older people are in need of protection. The second looks at abuse and neglect as a crime that needs to be responded to in terms of legal and legal issues, legal interventions and human rights. The third looks at elder abuse as family violence, or a family violence matter that needs to be responded to through private and more personalised interventions. The fourth approach views elder abuse as an issue of personhood, where the response needs to be that of empowerment, recognising the need for agency and also the positionality of older people in society. It is an approach that is ultimately highlighted from our findings of this study, and which I'm going to sort of discuss and develop further in regards to policy and practice. What I've done in terms of the findings is actually giving you some examples of direct quotes. So I'm not going to actually read them out, but you can look at the quotes as I go through each section. Okay, and I think that actually the quotes can be very powerful in terms of identifying or hearing the voice of older people in this process. The first one was around safety and well-being, and the findings sort of tended to illustrate that, or show that threats to safety and well-being were not necessarily centred on physical safety, unlike what we as professionals seem to be absorbed and focused on. Rather, participants focused on securing well-being over personal safety. The biggest threat they felt was the reduction of health status and the subsequent inability or lack of opportunities around decision-making, specifically care choices and where to live. They felt that dependence on others for care created greater potential for mistreatment, and being dependent was linked to the dread of going into a nursing home. There was a huge fear that if they disclosed abuse, that potentially that was going to happen, that they would end up in a nursing home. And I suppose traditionally that would well have been an outcome. Okay, loss of decision making. Accompanying a decrease in health status was the loss of control over decision making, particularly where higher levels of care were required. Participants felt that to avoid this loss of agency, maintaining the possession of their own home was imperative. This was a big issue in Ireland in terms of maintaining land and their home, and the participants talked a great deal about it. They were adamant that signing over their home to adult children or permitting them to move in to provide care was to be avoided. It was suggested that older people in Northern Ireland had more control in terms of living longer in their own home because of the care options and assistance available compared to the south. Okay, so reasons for non-disclosure was another area we covered. Participants believed that elder abuse occurred most often within caring relationships in the person's home, rooted in family and caring dynamics, or carer dynamics, and with paid and family care provision. It was recognised that willingness to undertake action or to admit that an adult child was being abusive to them could actually make elder abuse and prevention and intervention much more difficult. Participants explained the lack of disclosure on things such as the actual cultural norms within specific families, and the reluctance to corroborate others' accounts even if a family member was abusive. There was a fear of alternatives to family care. Participants were very concerned or were very fearful of admission to nursing home, and that was really, as I said, an ongoing sort of theme that came through the focus groups. Fear of the consequences of disclosing and subsequent repercussions in terms of family members, and Interestingly, from a practitioner's point of view, the negative perceptions of formal social service responses not being helpful or appropriate to their needs. Participants felt that easy access to clear information and was essential for encouraging disclosures of abuse. And they felt that they would be more willing to speak to someone if they had this knowledge and that it was done within a formal context. Once abuse is confirmed confirmed, participants believe professionals should work with older people quickly to determine what they wanted and what their plan was, and that the findings therefore indicate the need for older people to be reassured and to make aware that reporting elder abuse does not culminate in a person going into a nursing home, nor does it result in the end of a family relationship. This whole need to maintain family relationships was very important. Okay. The whole theme of staying connected, of course, was a major theme. The importance of services that enable people to carry out everyday tasks, staying connected within their communities and to their friends was really stressed. Participants suggested that access to rural transport schemes enable people to collect, that would enable older people to collect their pensions, provide opportunities to go shopping, all ensured that they had contact with friends and community. This maintained confidence and reduced social isolation and their dependence on others to carry out their task. Participants identified clubs, groups, churches, all as these opportunities to interact with others, which was all one way of actually preventing abuse. The provision and funding of community-based activities and workers for older people was viewed as a mechanism to support older people, making them less likely to accept mistreatment within the family context. They saw abuse very much as a family-centred issue, and some of the supports and they identified the problems of actually being able to confide in these issues to other family members. They felt that organised and regular visitations by public health nurses, community and voluntary groups were all essential in terms of preventing and identifying elder abuse. So staying connected, I think, it is probably is a key issue in terms of responses to elder abuse. Also, they identified the need to support family carers. They viewed supports for family carers as a preventative measure for elder abuse. And they could really understand how someone looking after an older person 24/7, they understood that the frustrations and the stresses of caring, and they felt that that needed to be also responded to and supported. Caring can create many tensions within families, and carers can become very isolated, losing contact themselves with friends and reducing their ability to share their feelings of frustration. It was also suggested that family guilt could result in them avoiding difficult decisions about caring. And one of the solutions that the participants talked about was a mentoring service for family carers, offering information and support to other family carers. Okay, the whole area of actually creating awareness was also raised by the participants within the focus groups. They felt this was particularly important, that this knowledge was largely based on media coverage, but they felt that there could be more specific television and radio advertisements to spread the news and to inform other older people. They felt that elder abuse needed to be advertised, or the whole issue needed to be advertised much more widely, and suggested that there's a greater role for service providers who are in regular contact with older people, like GPs, pharmacists, post officers, the local vet. They all played a role in regards to this issue. And participants spoke of education and information as a mechanism for prevention, occurring throughout the whole life course. They also talked about the role and interaction of professionals. They believe that care professionals working with older people not only had a legal duty of care, but also a moral one, and I think this is important to consider. However, formal carers entering people's homes they felt needed proper training, needed to be vetted and supervised more. They also felt that there needed to be more adequate training for paid carers. They felt older people should have more of a say in who is caring for them, in terms of who's coming into the home, and this would ensure that paid carers knew that they could be replaced on the older person's say-so, and this in turn could be a more preventative measure. In terms of what came out of the findings were two issues. One was this whole withdrawal of personhood, and I guess we sort of thought about, is this a new type of abuse? And also, how can professional practice and policy sort of enhance this whole concept of personhood? Of course, the older people within the groups did identify many of the typical sort of forms of abuse that are identified within the national policies, both here in Northern Ireland and in the Republic. But older people living in these communities believe that the understanding and the tackling of abuse needs to move outside these narrow definitions and conventional ways of thinking and look at the wider societal context and different understandings of abuse in terms of personhood. And by personhood abuse, I really refer to the gradual withdrawal from older people of the characteristics that make them human, with the same needs and rights as the rest of the society. So if we start looking at elder abuse from a personhood framework, and if you can think back, remember the chart that I had, there were 4 different ways of looking at it. If we start looking at it in terms of the personhood framework, then I think this requires some fundamental changes to policy and practice that goes beyond the present focus on protection and safeguarding older people, which is evident in the 2 documents, national documents around policies and practices. Abuse, understood from a protectionist standpoint, concentrates on meeting older people's physiological and safety needs, but it doesn't address their need for love, belonging, esteem and realisation of their potential. Hence, policies and practices to tackle the abuse of older people which evolve and operate within a health and social care framework often fail to address the underlying structures that undermine older people's confidence in their own ability to act, which can place them in even a much more vulnerable situation. Okay, so now just a few words in regards to implications for professional practice and implications for policy. At a practice level, access to informal resources and supports such as community services and workers trained in addressing elder abuse would helps to reduce older people's suspicion and fear associated with potentially procedural-driven and perceived overly efficient social service organisations. Okay, so this perception that the current services are very procedural driven, that they're not responding to their needs and they're not flexible enough around the specific nuances and cultural issues around abuse. They act as a source of they like the idea of more community services, community workers that can provide a source of information and create an awareness of elder abuse and older people's rights within community settings. Having information, they feel, is really crucial to empowerment. And I guess if this community development approach, they feel that this is the most effective, but of course this is dependent on funding and much more broader concepts of service delivery. Addressing abuse whilst also respecting family relationships and helping them to change is one of the major challenges facing professionals in this field. Professional practice needs to support personhood as as the subjective, interactive and social interface. The centrality of knowing the person, their values, their biography, relationships, and seeing them beyond the immediate needs are really very important and really reinforced by this study, along with the needs to address older people's fears, their emotional needs, their social needs, issues of loss and grief, and these are often neglected areas. The findings also indicate a responsibility for professionals to promote and advocate for older people's agency, dignity and rights within our community. And of course, there's also a requirement that some of these issues are translated into professional education. And I think the whole area of working with older people is not necessarily considered a specialist area of practice, and I think this could be really further developed through education for institutions such as Queen's. Okay, in terms of the policy implications, the study's findings suggest an understanding of elder abuse as multi-level and multi-dimensional social phenomena involving social, health, welfare, legal, rights discourses, including the concept of personhood as outlined in the model earlier. Personhood and prevention are key issues and key concepts that come out of this study, and as well as the need for older people to have access to more legal information, more financial information. Also, the whole issue of clarity around determining capacity seems to have come through in terms of maintaining decision-making as long as possible. Like who determines capacity, how is it measured? Because a lot of this can be very counterproductive in terms of older people's agency. Building older people's capacity, such as proactive advice and strategies to prevent poor decision-making, easy access to financial services, mediation services, family support services, and most importantly, strengthening community collaboration and the circles of support available to older people seem to be something that social policy needs to be addressing. I wanted to just mention two services that I'm currently involved with that I think are very good examples of how developing older people's circle of support and those networks that they felt was so important could really be developed. One is the Good Morning Network, which is a telephone network which actually links up with older people on a regular basis. And that, I don't know whether we actually see that as a preventative measure for people becoming isolated and therefore at risk of abuse. And another one is a very new project, which is Hubs for Older People, which is really targeting isolated older people within their homes, because I think this is a very important way of preventing abuse. So in conclusion, it can be argued that more sustainable and proactive models of social delivery and social policy, which interweave both informal sources of support to older people, such as family, friends, peers and community, with formal support such as health, welfare, advocacy and legal services, are really the key to empowering older people in our local communities. However, I think that it's still important to keep that focus, that we need to establish and know more about how older people think and feel about this issue. So on that note, I will finish. Thank you.